It is Black History Month, but so many white people wonder why there's not a White History Month. Probably because your history is satanic. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about some of the horrible, horrible things white people have done. Let's talk about your history. Your brutal history that is so bad that the government is trying to make sure that nobody can learn it. Because nobody wants to know how bad it really was. White people especially. Let's go. Transatlantic slave trade. 246 years where white people brutalize African Americans after stealing them from their homeland, and the brutal Middle Passage where millions of black people died. Then we had the slave trade, and within the slave trade, we have families being ripped apart. We have children being raped. We have all kind of brutalities happening, including Dr. Marion Sims, who is quoted as the godfather of gynecology, who would torture African-American women by doing different surgeries on them without any anesthesia. So that's the transatlantic slave trade, which made America rich and where a lot of the white wealth that you see came from. Indigenous genocide and land theft. So killed millions of indigenous people and then stole their land, and then currently has the nerve to be telling indigenous people that they're not true Americans under Donald Trump. So the fact that the land that is owned, the private property that is owned by all these white folks, was stolen. Most things white people steal. Some of the biggest thieves in history, right? Stole my people from Africa, then stole the land from the indigenous and genocided them. But wait, there's more. Colonization and genocide of Africa and Asia. So white folks killed 10 million people in the Congo. You don't hear about that. You hear about the 6 million Jews that were killed, but you don't hear about the 10 million Africans that were killed by white folks. Also, the British, due to their policies, starved thousands, if not millions, of Indians. Jim Crow and racial terrorism. This is the KKK terrorizing black families. This is lynching. They would have white folks come out with their children, have a picnic while watching a black person be tortured and then set on fire and then lynched. Then they would cut off our body parts and put them on their mantle. And sometimes they even ate us. Isn't white history just wonderful? Oh my goodness. This is why there is no White History Month, because your history is satanic. The Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed under Nazi Germany, which is very similar to the Nazi that's running our country right now. Pretty horrible. All kind of atrocities happened to the Jewish people under the name of white supremacy. Apartheid, where white people came to South Africa and then put the black people in a system of apartheid, which is very similar to Jim Crow. They lived in ghettos. They were mistreated. They had no rights. They had to learn the history of white folks. It was pretty horrific. And this is when Elon Musk moved to South Africa under apartheid because he's a white supremacist. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which nobody really knows about because, again, we don't talk about the horrors of white history. This is when white people gave a bunch of black men syphilis without treatment, without their knowledge, which led to a bunch of complications. I think it leads to deformity. It also leads to death. So they were saying to black people, oh, we want to, they didn't say this, but we want to run experiments and see if you're treated, if you're impacted by diseases the same way that white people are. They already knew that we were. They just wanted a reason to give black men syphilis. And again, they were untreated. They were told that they were receiving treatment, and really they were receiving the disease. The opioid crisis, where pharmaceutical companies push opioids on the community, and we still find people who are dealing with the opioid crisis, whether they're addicted to opioids or whether they've died from opioids. And again, these are white pharmaceutical companies that push these opioids on poor communities. Forced sterilization and eugenics. So this is when black, indigenous, and disabled and poor women were forced into sterilization by the government to make sure that they could not reproduce. This didn't happen to white women. Again, this is white privilege. You were protected from this. We were forced into sterilization so we could not create more children. And then redlining, which led to systematic economic oppression and led to generations of poverty because that prevented black people from home ownership. This is not an exhaustive list of the satanic, horrible forms of terrorism that white people have contributed throughout history. There's much, much more. But this is why there is no White History Month, because if you really get into white history, it's pretty horrific. And white people hate facing their past, hate facing the reality, and never want to learn about the atrocities that they have really committed. And because of white supremacy, they're sanitized from all of this, right? I know about all of this because I'm black and I've done my history, but white folks don't know know their history. And really the reality is that Black and Indigenous folks know white people better than they know themselves, because we've had to study you in order to survive. And you are in a delusion, right? You're in a delusion where you think that white people are supreme. You're in a delusion where you think that you're supposed to rule. You're in a delusion where you think that Black and Indigenous people deserve to be where they are. Like, you're not in the real world, right? We live in the real world where we see white people for what they are. We see the brutality that you cause. We see the harm that you cause. We see that how you're the biggest thieves in the history of the world. You are the biggest murderers in the history of the world. Nobody has committed more acts of violence than you. You want to make it and say, oh, Black and Mexicans, all those other people are committing acts of violence. But globally, it is you, as seen by this horrible list of the millions and 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 millions of people that white supremacy has killed throughout time. Not just the Indigenous, not just the Africans, not just the Indians, not just people in Congo, not just the Jewish people, not just the people in South Africa, right? So many people have been harmed by white supremacy and continue to be harmed by white supremacy. So if there was a White History Month, that's what you learned. And Black history, when you learn Black history, it is just us overcoming all your fucking bullshit that you put us through. Happy White History Month.